Hey, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. It's January 14th, 1943, and the sun isn't even up yet, but the villa is already alive. There's guards at the gates and trucks idling in the courtyard. A runner is whispering that Churchill is moving early again. Inside, a man by the name of Harry Hopkins wakes with the same exhaustion he's been carrying for months. His sleep is still shallow, and he knows today isn't going to offer a break. See, we're in Casablanca, and Casablanca isn't romance or movie fog. It's heat and secrecy and sand on your tongue and pressure wrapped around a war that isn't even finished yet. Harry steadies himself against a wall before stepping into President Franklin D. Roosevelt's quarters, and the president looks worn, even more than usual. Around them, staff are folding briefing folders or adjusting the president's wheelchair or mapping out the route through the narrow stone corridors in the villa. Outside, the temperature is already climbing, and inside, the tension is already ahead of it. See, here's the thing. Officially, this conference is about defeating Hitler. Unofficially, everyone in the villa knows the conversations won't stop at battle maps. They'll drift towards the questions nobody wants to say out loud. What will Europe look like when the smoke clears? Who's going to rebuild it? And how are we going to keep the world from sliding into another collapse like the one that followed the last war? Hopkins watches Roosevelt adjust his glasses and give that thin, familiar smile, the one that says he's ready, even if his body isn't. And Harry recognizes the signal. Today won't just be strategy. It'll be positioning, influence, leverage, a quiet contest between two leaders who see the future very differently. Harry scans the agenda one more time and feels the weight of what's coming. But how much can two men really shape the world behind closed doors while armies fight continents away? How do whispered questions about currency and stability and recovery fit inside a war council meeting? And on January 14th, 1943, how did a villa in North Africa become the place where the future of the post-war economy quietly began? From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain the stories that changed business forever. Every date on the calendar has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, January 14th, that story takes us to 1943, when Allies designed the peace before winning the war. Harry Hopkins had seen Roosevelt through darker weeks than this, but Casablanca felt different. The president's health was continuing to slip. His lungs were weak, his legs unreliable, and the travel alone had been a gamble. But he insisted on coming, partly because he needed Churchill to see him in the room, not through cables, partly because decisions made from a safe distance away always have a way of drifting off course. Now, Harry Hopkins can read a room better than pretty much anybody. Churchill carried himself like a man performing on a stage that he had built. Confident, talkative, always ready with an argument. Roosevelt entered every space differently. Quiet, observant, letting others fill the air so he could measure their intentions. Two leaders, same alliance, entirely different instincts. Hopkins felt the tension rising even before the first briefing. The British staff talked openly about post-war control in the Mediterranean and the future of French colonies. The Americans whispered about financial stability, industrial rebuilding, and stopping the world from falling into the same economic chaos that followed the First World War. The war might still be raging, but the argument beneath it was the peace that would follow. What bothered Harry wasn't the disagreement. It was the speed. At home, the country was producing ships and tanks and aircraft at a pace no economy had ever matched. Here in Casablanca, the leaders were being forced into another kind of coordination, one where wartime logistics collided with long-term economic strategy. And with that in mind, Harry understood the president's real reason for being here. Winning the war mattered, but shaping what came after mattered more. The world wouldn't survive another unstable peace, and this conference would test whether the Allies really understood that. The turning point didn't arrive with a dramatic announcement. It showed up in a quieter moment, when the military briefings ended and the agenda shifted to what everyone avoided saying out loud: the future. Harry Hopkins watched Roosevelt guide the conversation away from troop movements and toward something broader, not through speeches, but through steady questions. What happens when Europe collapses financially after the war? Who controls the reconstruction funding? How do you keep currency failures and political instability from feeding into the next conflict? Churchill didn't want those questions lingering. Roosevelt made sure they did. Churchill argued in terms of territory and influence and imperial obligations. Roosevelt talked about markets and currencies and long-term stability. One leader trying to preserve an old order, the other preparing to build a new one. Hopkins could see the friction forming across the table, and for the first time, even some in Churchill's circle seemed to sense the shift. The world wasn't waiting for the British Empire anymore. General George Marshall added a layer Churchill couldn't dismiss. Winning the war required coordinated production, shared supply routes, and predictable flows of materials across continents. Those same principles, Marshall argued, would define the peace. The war had already created a global supply chain. The post-war world would need a system to manage it. And at that moment, Hopkins recognized what Casablanca really was. It wasn't just a strategy conference. They were building a blueprint. The ideas that would eventually shape post-war finance and global cooperation weren't drafted formally here, but they were born here in these off-script exchanges among leaders who understood that economic stability had become the backbone of international security. And Harry Hopkins saw it before anyone said it plainly. The Allies weren't just planning to win the war, they were planning to design the world that followed.
Obtén tu diploma de secundaria por ti y por tu familia. Visita completatudiploma.org para encontrar centros educativos gratuitos cerca de ti. Presentado por Dollar General Literacy Foundation y The Ad Council.
For the next 10 days, Harry Hopkins watched the conference bend under the weight of two competing visions. But he also watched something new take shape. Once again, not in the speeches or the photo ops, but in the side rooms where the real work was happening. Military officers, economists, diplomats, and production chiefs began speaking a common language, one built around supply, stability, and being able to scale up. He understood what that meant. Wartime coordination had forced nations to share information they once protected. Production schedules, shipping routes, fuel requirements, manufacturing capacity. Details that used to be guarded inside individual governments were now the backbone of Allied cooperation. And once that door opened, it didn't close again. Industrial planning had become international planning. Churchill still pushed hard to protect British influence, but even he couldn't ignore the numbers. The United States was producing more than any nation in history. Whoever shaped the terms of post-war recovery would shape the world that followed. And Roosevelt intended for that influence to lead to stability, not another fragile peace that would crumble as soon as the guns fell silent. And because of that, Harry felt the implications more than he spoke them. Casablanca wouldn't be remembered for its public statements. It would be remembered for planting the idea that economic groundwork mattered as much as battlefield strategy. that winning the peace required rules, coordination, and a shared understanding of how nations would rebuild. Years later, people would point to other conferences as the place where those systems were finalized. But Harry Hopkins knew the spark was earlier, in this heat-soaked villa on the edge of North Africa, where two exhausted leaders started thinking beyond victory. And it all began on January 14th, 1943. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, please do me a favor and don't forget to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to actually understand business without the fluff or the buzzwords or the MBA language, start by visiting businessdailypodcast.com.
We all crave something new. At Hertz, new is what we're all about. New adventures, new experiences. When you book with us, you'll be cruising in our newest fleet yet. New features, new tech, and of course, that new car smell. All that wonderful newness, all with no strings attached. So go on, book your new car fling at Hertz.com. Your old car at home never has to know.